The great hall of the Velari Empire stretched endlessly, with high crystal walls that reflected the light of distant stars. Every step Princess Silara took echoed in the silence, as though the entire universe was watching her walk. Her long, silver robes dragged across the floor, heavy not from fabric but from the weight of duty pressing on her shoulders. Today was not a day of choice. It was a day of command. The elders of her people had spoken. She was to marry, not for love, not for desire, but for the survival of the empire. The Velari way had always been the same. Bloodlines were chains that bound families together. Marriages were tools, not dreams. Silara had known since childhood that her hand in marriage would never belong to her alone. Still, she had hoped that the empire might grant her some dignity, some measure of freedom. Instead, they had chosen for her a groom unlike any she could have imagined, a human. Silara's jaw tightened as she stood before the throne of her father, Emperor Velaris, whose sharp black eyes betrayed no emotion. He sat tall, crowned in gold that glowed like fire, his presence as overwhelming as the empire itself. To his right stood the High Council, ancient and cold, their faces unreadable masks. "The Union will secure peace," her father said, his deep voice filling the hall. "The Terran Confederation is weak but useful. By binding them to us through marriage, they cannot turn against us." Silara bowed her head, her thoughts hidden. She had studied humans before. They were young compared to the Velari. Their technology was growing fast, their curiosity endless, but their bodies were fragile, their traditions chaotic. Among the great species of the galaxy, humans were often dismissed as reckless children, and now one of those reckless children would be her husband. The doors of the hall opened, and silence fell. Guards in shining armor stepped aside as the human entered. Silara turned her eyes toward him, expecting to see a man nervous, unsure, or overwhelmed by the splendor of the empire. Instead, he walked with steady steps, his head high. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, his suit simple but well-fitted, not nearly as ornate as the clothing of Velari nobles. His eyes, human eyes, brown and ordinary to his kind, met hers without fear. David Hale, diplomat of the Terran Confederation. He stopped before the throne, bowed slightly, not too deeply, not too casually. Just enough to acknowledge respect without surrendering his dignity. "Your Majesty," David said, his voice calm and even. "It is an honor to be received into your court." The Emperor studied him in silence. Silara's gaze lingered as well, expecting to find cracks in his composure. But David stood as though this moment was no burden, as though he had not just been thrust into the heart of the galaxy's most rigid empire. The High Council whispered among themselves, their voices like rustling leaves. One finally spoke. "You will remember your place, human. The princess is not your equal. You are here to serve the empire through this union." Silara's chest tightened at those words. That was the truth of it. She was not a bride, and he was not a groom. They were pieces on a board, moved for strategy. David, however, did something that made her breath catch. He smiled. Not mockingly, not arrogantly, but with quiet confidence. "With respect, counselor," he replied, "I did not come here to serve. I came here to build something. If this marriage is to mean anything, then the princess is not my lesser, nor I hers. We walk together, or we do not walk at all." The hall went still. No one spoke to the Velari Council like that, not even other nobles. Silara felt her heart beat faster, not from anger but from shock. The Emperor's dark eyes narrowed, then flicked toward Silara. "What do you think of this man, daughter?" Silara had been trained to answer carefully, to hide her feelings, behind polished words. Yet for the first time in years she was at a loss. She should have dismissed him, called him arrogant, demanded obedience. That was what they expected. But instead she said softly, "He does not speak as a servant, father. He speaks as himself." The Emperor's mouth curved into the slightest of smirks. So he does. The council murmured in disapproval, but the decision had already been made. The ceremony would take place soon. Later, in the private gardens of the palace, Solara found herself standing beside David for the first time without a crowd watching. The night sky glowed with unfamiliar constellations, and the air smelled faintly of iron from the great fountains that sprayed shimmering silver water. "You are bold," she said, her voice low. "Do you know what danger you put yourself in, speaking so to the council?" David glanced at her, a small grin tugging at his lips. "Do you know what danger you put yourself in, speaking to me like this?" Solara blinked, caught off guard. She had expected caution, even fear. Instead, he met her words with humor. "You don't fear them?" she asked. "I respect them," David said. "But fear? No. Fear doesn't build peace. Fear builds walls." He paused, looking at the stars above. "And I think you already have enough walls here." His words struck something deep in her chest. She wanted to deny it, to tell him he didn't understand, but she could not. For years she had felt the walls of duty and expectation closing in. Now this strange human, who knew nothing of her struggles, spoke as though he had seen into her soul. "You speak too freely," she whispered. "And you speak too carefully," he answered. For the first time that day, Solara laughed, softly, almost against her will. The sound startled her as though it had been locked away for years. David looked at her, not as a prize, not as a duty, but simply as another person. She felt it in the way his gaze lingered, not heavy, not demanding, just present. Perhaps this marriage would not be what the council expected. Perhaps it would be something more. The days that followed were a blur of rituals. The Veilari demanded precision in every step, every word. Ceremonial robes were fitted, oaths rehearsed, feasts prepared. David, though alien to these traditions, learned quickly. Where others stumbled or panicked, he observed carefully, asking quiet questions, listening more than he spoke. Solara watched him, curious despite herself. Humans were supposed to be careless, impulsive, impatient. But David was none of those things. He was steady, patient, and above all unafraid to speak truth when truth was needed. Once during a rehearsal, a noble sneered at him. "Do not look into the princess's eyes. It is disrespectful." David had tilted his head, then calmly replied, "With all due respect, if I cannot look at her, then I cannot know her. And if I do not know her, then this union is meaningless." Solara's cheeks had warmed at his words, though she said nothing. At night, alone in her chambers, she found herself thinking of him more than she wished. His voice, his stubborn courage, his refusal to be bent by the Empire's traditions. For the first time in her life, Solara wondered if marriage might not be the prison she feared. It might, just might, be the key to freedom. And so the day came. The grand chamber filled with nobles, banners waving high, music echoing through the crystal walls. Solara stood at the altar, her heart steady but her thoughts racing. Across from her stood David, dressed in robes of deep blue, the color of Earth's oceans, chosen by him to honor his people. Their eyes met. This was no ordinary union. It was the beginning of something the Veilari Empire had never expected. The palace was alive with whispers. Every corridor, every balcony, every gathering of nobles buzzed with the same rumor. The human does not bow. To the Veilari, this was scandalous. For thousands of years, obedience to tradition had been the center of their empire. Every bow, every word, every gesture had meaning. But David Hale, the Terran diplomat who had just married their princess, refused to bend to rules that stripped away dignity. It began subtly. During the marriage feast, when nobles expected him to eat last, David had simply asked, "Why?" His tone had been calm, not mocking, but the question itself had startled everyone. The nobles stammered that it was tradition, that the highest-born ate first and the lowest-born last. David had smiled, taken a portion of food, and said, "On Earth, we eat together. It tastes better that way." The hall had fallen into shocked silence. Some nobles muttered angrily. Others hid smiles behind their cups. Solara herself had been frozen, torn between horror at his audacity and a strange flicker of admiration. From that moment, the court was divided. Some whispered that the human groom was dangerous, a rebel who might corrupt the princess. Others whispered something even stranger, that perhaps his way was not rebellion but truth. Days passed, and Solara found herself drawn to David's differences. In the mornings, he would walk with her through the crystal gardens, asking questions no one else dared ask. "Do you ever get tired of them telling you what to do?" he asked once, his hands folded behind his back. Solara hesitated. She had been raised never to admit weakness, never to question the Empire's ways. Yet with him, the words slipped out. Every day, David looked at her not with pity but with understanding. "Then maybe it's time they start asking you what to do." His words struck her deeply. She had always been a tool, a symbol, a piece in her father's games. But when David spoke, it was as though he saw Solara, not the princess, not the heir, but the woman beneath the crown. At first she resisted. He was human, and humans were supposed to be insignificant. But the more time she spent with him, the more she realized how wrong those teachings were. The turning point came during a council meeting. The emperor sat on his high throne, Solara by his side, and David behind them, as was proper. The nobles discussed trade routes and border disputes, their voices droning on with endless formality. Then one counselor mentioned an uprising on a distant colony world. "They demand fair treatment," the nobles sneered. "They forget their place. We should send soldiers and burn their rebellion before it spreads." Solara kept her face still, but inside her heart sank. She knew those colonies. The people there suffered under heavy taxes, their children starving while nobles grew fat. But to speak out was dangerous. Her voice would be ignored, even punished. Before she could say a word, David stepped forward. "Forgive me," he said, his voice carrying across the chamber. "But have you tried listening to them?" The room erupted in outrage. Nobles leapt to their feet, shouting that a human had no right to speak in council. The emperor raised his hand, silencing them, his eyes cold on David. "Explain yourself." David did not flinch. "On Earth we learned that force only makes rebellion grow. If you send soldiers, you will create martyrs. If you listen, you may find peace." The nobles roared in anger. "Peace through weakness? Impossible. He insults us with his primitive ways." Solara watched, heart pounding, as her father studied, David in silence. Then the emperor turned to her. "Daughter, what say you?" Every eye turned to Solara. The weight of tradition pressed on her shoulders. She should dismiss David's words, call them foolish, protect her place in the court. But then she remembered the gardens. "Do you ever get tired of them telling you what to do?" She lifted her chin. "I say he speaks wisely. Perhaps it is time." We listened, not only commanded. Gasps filled the chamber. Nobles stared at her as though she had grown wings. The emperor's face darkened, but he said nothing. The council moved on, but the moment lingered like a spark in dry grass. For the first time, Solara had sided with someone against her own people. For the first time, she had felt free. That night, Solara confronted David in the gardens. "You put me in danger today," she said sharply. "Do you know what it means to defy the council?" David looked at her calmly. "Do you know what it means to stay silent while injustice grows?" Her breath caught. His words were simple, but they cut through years of obedience. She turned away, staring at the silver fountains. "You do not understand this empire. You do not understand what it costs to stand against it." "Maybe not," David admitted, stepping closer. "But I understand you, and I think you're stronger than you believe." Solara's heart beat fast. No one had ever spoken to her like this. To her people, she was a symbol, a tool. To David, she was simply Solara. For the first time in her life, she felt seen. In the days that followed, the whispers grew louder. "The princess defends her human groom. The human speaks in council. Perhaps the empire is changing. Some nobles were furious, plotting to shame David or remove him quietly. Others were curious, asking questions about Earth, about human customs. A few even began to wonder if their traditions were as perfect as they claimed. Solara herself felt torn. She had grown up believing her empire's ways were unshakable truths. But every day with David chipped away at that certainty. His laughter in tense moments, his refusal to treat her as property, his endless questions, these things unsettled her, yet they also gave her hope. One evening during a banquet, Solara overheard two nobles whispering, "The human is dangerous. He will corrupt the princess." "Perhaps corruption is what this empire needs," the other replied softly. Solara hid a smile. As their bond grew, Solara found herself speaking more openly with David. She told him of her childhood, of the endless lessons, the suffocating rules, the loneliness of being raised as a symbol instead of a person. David listened, never judging, never interrupting. When she finished, he said only, "No one deserves to live in a cage, no matter how beautiful the bars." Those words stayed with her. The empire was changing, though most did not yet see it. In council meetings, Solara spoke more boldly, often echoing David's questions. When nobles demanded obedience, she asked, "Why?" When they insisted on violence, she asked, "What will it solve?" Each time the chamber grew restless, uncertain, unsettled. Her father watched silently, his expression unreadable. The emperor was no fool. He saw the shift in his daughter, the influence of the human. Yet he said nothing. For now, Solara knew a storm was coming. Change always brought storms. But for the first time in her life, she did not fear it, because she was no longer alone. One night, standing on a balcony overlooking the city, Solara turned to David. "Do you realize what you've done?" He raised an eyebrow. "Made a lot of nobles angry?" She laughed softly. "More than that, you've changed me. You've made me see that I have choices, even when I thought I had none." David's smile was gentle. "You always had choices, Solara. You just needed someone to remind you." She looked at him, her heart heavy and light all at once. Perhaps they were wrong to think marrying a human would be harmless. Or perhaps, David said, they were right, just not in the way they expected. Solara gazed at him, and for the first time since her marriage was arranged, she felt not trapped, but hopeful. The alien princess had no choice but to marry. But her human groom was teaching her something she had never known before: freedom. The air in the council chamber was heavy, thicker than usual, as though the walls themselves understood the danger pressing down on the empire. Princess Solara sat beside her father, her face calm, though her thoughts raced. David stood just a step behind her, his presence steady like a shield she hadn't realized she needed until now. The nobles were restless. Their voices rose louder than before, filled with fear and anger. "The rival faction grows bolder," one counselor declared. His pale skin shimmered under the chamber's crystal lights. "They send warships along our borders. They challenge our honor by calling this marriage an insult." Another noble slammed a fist onto the table. "A human husband for our princess? They say we have betrayed our blood. They call us weak. If we do not crush them, they will not stop until the empire burns." Solara's eyes narrowed, though she remained silent. She knew the council well. To them, strength meant war, honor meant domination. They could not imagine another path. But she also knew the rival faction's words carried weight. Many outside the empire had already mocked her union with a human. She herself had once feared it would be a curse. Yet now, as she glanced back at David standing calm while anger boiled all around, she felt a strange certainty that her people were blind to something important. Her father, the emperor, lifted a hand. The chamber fell into silence. His voice was steady, cold, and full of command. "They accuse us of weakness," he said. Then we will show them strength. If they test our patience again, they will know the fire of the Velari fleet." The nobles cheered. Solara's stomach tightened. She wanted to speak, to say that fire only led to ashes, but before she could open her mouth, David stepped forward. "With respect, Emperor," David said, his voice calm but firm, "violence is exactly what they want." The cheering stopped. Heads turned sharply, eyes filled with outrage. A noble hissed, "Silence, human, you were not asked to speak." But David did not step back. He looked directly at the Emperor, his brown human eyes steady. "If you respond with war, you confirm their accusation. You prove them right, that this marriage was weakness, and that the Empire fears being mocked. They will unite others against you, and the galaxy will bleed." Gasps echoed through the chamber. No one spoke to the Emperor like this. Not even his oldest advisors. The Emperor's expression hardened. "You dare presume to know the ways of Empire? You who come from a fragile world barely reaching the stars?" David bowed his head slightly, but his words carried no fear. "I do not presume to know your empire, Majesty, but I know people. Where I come from, we have fought wars for pride. We have watched them burn nations to the ground. Pride is never worth the ashes it leaves behind." The chamber erupted in shouts. Nobles called him foolish, arrogant, dangerous. Solara's heart pounded. Every instinct screamed at her to remain silent, to protect herself. But something within her refused to let David stand alone. She rose to her feet. "The human speaks. Truth." The room froze. "My people," Solara continued, her voice clear, "we have always believed strength lies only in force, but perhaps strength also lies in restraint. If we fight every insult with war, then our empire is not strong, it is fragile. Fragile and afraid." Her words struck the chamber like thunder. Nobles looked at her with shock, some with fury, others with a dawning uncertainty. The Emperor's eyes narrowed at his daughter. For a long moment, silence hung heavy. Finally, he spoke. "Leave us," he commanded the council. The nobles hesitated, then bowed and filed out, their robes sweeping across the polished floor. Soon only the Emperor, Solara, and David remained. The Emperor's gaze burned into them both. "You defy me in front of the council. You place trust in this outsider." Solara stood tall, though her heart raced. "He is not an outsider. He is my husband, and he sees things we do not." David said nothing, letting her speak. The Emperor's expression softened slightly, though his voice was still sharp. "You risk tearing the Empire apart, Solara. One wrong step and you will not only lose your throne, you will lose your life." Solara met his gaze. "Then perhaps the Empire should change before it breaks us all." The Emperor said no more. He turned and left the chamber, his heavy robes trailing behind him. That night, Solara stood with David on a high balcony overlooking the city. The streets glowed with blue lights, ships gliding like fireflies in the distance. But the beauty could not hide the storm gathering beyond the stars. "They will not forgive me for what I said," Solara whispered. David leaned against the railing, his eyes on the sky. "Maybe not, but they will remember it. And that's the beginning." She turned to him. "Do you truly believe restraint is strength? To the Velari, it sounds like weakness." David smiled faintly. "On Earth, we learned that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is not strike back. It shows you are in control, not ruled by anger. That's real power." Solara studied him, her chest tight. He was unlike anyone she had ever known. He questioned what others accepted. He saw paths where her people saw walls, and yet he was only human, fragile, young, from a world her people barely respected. So why did his words shake her more than the shouts of 1,000 nobles? The next day, the rival faction made their move. An envoy ship arrived at the edge of Velari space, broadcasting a challenge across the stars. Their leader, a tall and scarred alien named Lord Karath, appeared on every screen in the capital. His voice was filled with scorn. "Velari Empire," Karath declared. You dishonor yourselves by wedding your princess to a weak and pitiful species. If you had any pride, you would cast him out and show the galaxy your strength. Instead, you prove your weakness to all." Gasps echoed across the city. Citizens gathered in the streets to watch. Nobles shouted for war, demanding the fleet be unleashed. The Emperor stood silent, weighing his choice. Before he could speak, David stepped forward into the broadcast chamber. "Lord Karoth," David said, his voice steady though millions were watching, "you call my people weak because we do not measure strength as you do. But I say this, true weakness is needing war to prove yourself. True strength is building peace when war would be easier." The room went still. Even Solara could hardly breathe. Karoth laughed cruelly. "And who are you to speak for an empire not your own?" David's eyes narrowed. "I am no emperor. I am only human. But I will not bow to pride, and I will not let fear rule this marriage. You call me weak? Then test me, not with armies, but with truth. Meet us in open council. Speak before the galaxy, not from the shadows of threats." Karoth sneered, but something in his expression faltered. "You are a fool, human, but very well. Let the galaxy watch as the Velari bow to weakness." The screen went dark. The nobles erupted in rage, shouting that David had shamed them, that he had provoked disaster. But Solara saw something else in their eyes, uncertainty, doubt, a crack in the armor of tradition. She turned to David, her heart full. "You risked everything," she whispered. David looked at her with quiet determination. "So did you when you stood for me in council. We are in this together, Solara, always." Her chest tightened. For the first time, she truly believed it. That night, as she lay awake in her chambers, Solara realized the truth. Her marriage had begun as a cage, a prison forced upon her by duty. But now, it was becoming something more. Together, she and her human husband had challenged the empire itself. Together, they had faced the fury of nobles and the scorn of enemies. The council chamber was unlike anything David had ever seen. The walls of crystal reflected light in dazzling patterns, and the seats were filled with nobles whose expressions ranged from curiosity to open contempt. Across the chamber sat Lord Karoth and his delegation, every one of them tense and ready for provocation. Solara stood beside David, her hands lightly brushing his arm for reassurance. She had never felt more nervous, yet more determined. The eyes of the Empire were upon them. The galaxy was watching, and for the first time, she felt that the weight on her shoulders could be shared. Her human husband took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Esteemed leaders," David began, his voice calm but clear, "we are not here to hide behind threats or pride. We are here to speak openly, and we ask the same from you. Let us resolve this conflict not with war, but with truth." A murmur went through the chamber. The nobles of the empire whispered nervously to each other. Even the rival delegation looked skeptical, unsure what to make of a human who demanded honesty over intimidation. Lord Karoth sneered. "You speak of truth, human. And what truth can you possibly offer to a species far older and wiser than yours?" David met his gaze steadily. "The truth that strength is not only measured by firepower. True strength is shown when you can meet an enemy without raising a weapon. True wisdom is knowing when words can achieve more than threats." Solara's heart pounded. These were words her people would never have said on their own. Yet somehow, with David at her side, the chamber seemed to hold its breath. One of the Velari nobles scoffed. "Words will not stop ships from firing." David smiled faintly. "No, they won't. But words can prevent the need for ships to fire at all." The debate went on for hours. Each side presented claims, accusations, and arguments. Every time, Lord Karoth accused the Empire of weakness. David calmly responded, not with anger but with logic, empathy, and patience. He told stories of Earth, families who survived wars by speaking with enemies, leaders who prevented bloodshed by listening, To those they feared, cities rebuilt because compromise had taken precedence over pride. Solara watched him in awe. Humans were fragile, yes. They could be hurt easily, but their minds were adaptable, their hearts resilient. David had a courage unlike any Velari warrior she had ever known. He dared to face scorn and still remain unshaken, using cleverness instead of weapons. The rival delegation began to shift uncomfortably. They expected bluster, threats, displays of force, but David offered neither. His calm, confident human way unnerved them. A young Velari noble whispered to her neighbor, He is changing the debate. I do not understand it." Solara smiled quietly. That was exactly what was happening. Her husband was showing her people something new, that humans could alter the course of history not through strength alone, but through wisdom and courage. At one point, Lord Karoth grew frustrated. "Enough. Your words mean nothing. We will not yield to this human or to your princess." David leaned forward slightly. "Then let us test ideas instead of ego. Show the council what you want to happen, and we will show them what could happen if we choose another way." Karoth laughed mockingly. "You speak in riddles." "No riddles," David replied. "Just possibilities." And then he presented a plan, a proposal the Velari had never considered. Instead of meeting force with force, he suggested opening trade routes and diplomatic talks between the rival factions, offering neutral ground for discussion. He proposed shared responsibilities in border systems and joint oversight of disputed planets. Every solution minimized bloodshed, preserved pride, and ensured both sides maintained honor. Solara felt her pulse quicken. These were radical ideas for the Empire, yet they were sound, clear, and reasonable, and they had a human simplicity to them that made them harder to dismiss than traditional strategies filled with threats and dominance. Hours passed. Arguments flew back and forth. The Velari nobles argued over protocol and etiquette, while Karoth's delegation demanded respect and compensation. Throughout it all, David remained steady. He listened more than he spoke, asking pointed questions that revealed the flaws in each side's assumptions. He encouraged compromise, not surrender. Solara realized something astonishing. This human, this supposedly fragile creature, was commanding respect not through fear, but through intellect, courage, and integrity. Mies. The time the sun, or rather the twin suns outside the crystal walls, began to set, the council had reached a tentative agreement. It was not perfect. Some nobles grumbled. Karoth did not look pleased. But the galaxy had seen something remarkable. A human had changed the conversation, and in doing so, altered the course of a potential war. After the council, Solara walked, with David through the palace gardens. The fountains sparkled in the evening light, silver water dancing in patterns that reminded her of stars. "You did it," she said softly. "You turned their anger into something else, something they could not fight." David shook his head. "I didn't do it alone. You stood with me. Every time you spoke up, you gave me strength." She smiled, a genuine warmth she had not felt in years. "They called you a weak human, David. But you are anything but weak. And yet," he said, "humans are fragile. That is why we learn to adapt, to think, to understand. Sometimes, our strength comes from our weaknesses because we have to survive them." Solara studied him, realizing the truth of it. The Empire had underestimated humans. They had counted them as weak, incapable of true leadership or influence. But this human, her husband, was proving that human resilience, intelligence, and empathy could reshape entire worlds. The following weeks were filled with quiet tension. The Velari nobles who had opposed David began observing him in secret. They noted his patience in negotiations, his creativity in problem-solving, and his ability to remain calm under pressure. Some began to murmur cautiously. Perhaps humans are not so simple as we thought. Solara noticed these changes too. She herself began questioning the old rules more openly. She realized that her father's empire had always valued hierarchy and obedience above all else, but she saw now that respect could be earned in ways other than fear. One evening she spoke to her father privately. "Father, the council accepted the humans' plan. The rival faction has agreed to talks. Perhaps there is more strength in peace than in anger." The emperor studied her, his face unreadable. "You speak as if humans know better than us." "Not better," she said firmly. "Different. And sometimes different is exactly what we need." Her father said nothing, but Solara saw a flicker of thought in his eyes. Even the emperor could not ignore results. At night, as the twin moons rose over the palace, Solara and David stood on the balcony again, overlooking the city. "Do you think they will ever truly respect humans?" she asked. David smiled softly. "Perhaps not fully, but respect is earned, and they have seen what humans can do when they act with courage and wisdom. That is the first step." Solara nodded. She thought of the council, of the nobles shifting in their seats, of the rival faction reluctantly agreeing to dialogue. She realized something profound. Humans had power not in weapons, not in strength, but in their ability to think, to adapt, and to remain true to their principles even when the world doubted them. Her heart swelled with pride, not for herself, not for the empire, but for her husband, and for her people who would see a new way forward because of him. "This," she whispered, "is only the beginning." David turned to her, taking her hand gently. "Yes, but beginnings matter most. The first step is always the hardest, and most important." Solara squeezed his hand, feeling hope and determination fill her. Together they had faced doubt, danger, and tradition, and they had begun to change an empire. The alien princess had no choice but to marry. But with her human groom by her side, she knew they could guide the empire toward a new future, one built on wisdom, courage, and the unique strength of humanity. The twin suns of the Velari Empire rose over the capital city, casting long golden reflections across the crystal towers. The streets below were alive with citizens and nobles alike, whispering about the unprecedented events of recent weeks. The marriage of Princess Solara and David Hale had not only survived scrutiny, it had begun to reshape the empire. Solara stood on a high balcony of the palace overlooking the bustling city. She wore a simple gown, unlike the heavy ceremonial robes of old. Beside her, David adjusted his collar, scanning the horizon with quiet intensity. Though humans were physically smaller and less imposing than the Velari, David's presence radiated something far more formidable: calm, intelligence, and courage. "The council will meet today to finalize the agreements with the rival faction," Solara said softly. "It will determine if this empire continues its old ways, or embraces something new." David placed a hand on her shoulder. "Whatever happens, Solara, you've already changed more than you realize. You stood for truth, for fairness, and for your own voice. That alone has altered history." Solara looked at him, admiration and affection in her eyes. "You've changed me too. You've shown me that I can lead, not just follow. That the empire does not have to crush others to survive." David smiled. "Then let's make sure they understand it too." The council chamber was tense. The nobles had gathered once more, but this time the mood was different. Gone was the air of rigid tradition and unshakable certainty. There was curiosity, caution, and an unspoken awareness that the events of the past weeks had shifted power, not through weapons, but through ideas. Lord Karoth, the leader of the rival faction, stood on the opposite side. He was as imposing as ever, his tall frame and scarred face a reminder of the strength and aggression he commanded. Yet even he seemed unsettled. The calm confidence of a human who dared speak to the Velari Empire had caught him off guard. Solara stepped forward, her voice strong and steady. "Today is not about tradition. It is not about pride or fear. It is about choice, and we choose peace." The chamber murmured. Many nobles frowned, unconvinced. Yet there was a strange weight to her words, a conviction that could not be ignored. David spoke next. The galaxy is vast and conflicts are easy to ignite, but humans have learned that the cost of war is always higher than the cost of understanding. True strength is measured not by how much you can destroy, but by how much you can protect. Solara watched as the chamber shifted. Some nobles whispered to each other. Others looked away, unable to meet David's unwavering gaze. Even Lord Karoth paused, studying the human who dared lecture an empire on restraint. David laid out a final proposal, simple yet revolutionary for the Velari. The disputed territories would be jointly managed, with representatives from both factions. Trade and resources would be shared fairly, ensuring prosperity without domination. Communication channels would remain open at all times, with neutral mediators ensuring transparency. Both factions would meet monthly to discuss potential conflicts before they escalated. It was a plan that required trust, not weapons. Cooperation, not conquest. A murmur of disbelief spread through the chamber. Impossible, one noble muttered. Our traditions demand dominance, not compromise. Solara's eyes blazed. Traditions do not define us. We do. And we can choose to create a legacy we are proud of. David added quietly, sometimes, the greatest victories are won without battles. Today, we have a chance to prove that. Hours passed as debate continued. Arguments flared, tempers rose, and the past of Velari customs clashed with the possibilities of a future shaped by wisdom rather than fear. Finally, a breakthrough came. One by one, the nobles began to nod, convinced that this path, though unconventional, was wiser than war. Even some of the hardest critics saw that a new approach could bring stability, respect, and influence far beyond what brute force ever could. Lord Karoth, after much deliberation, stood. His voice was sharp, but quieter than before. We will agree to these terms. Not out of trust in your human, he said, eyes flicking to David, but because the alternative is folly. Let the galaxy see that we are capable of judgment. David inclined his head respectfully. Then let us begin. Solara felt a wave of relief, pride, and awe. The human at her side had not only challenged centuries of rigid tradition, but had also won the respect of enemies and allies alike. After the council, the city erupted in celebration. Citizens cheered from streets and rooftops. The human diplomat, once seen as fragile and insignificant, had become a symbol of hope. Solara walked through the streets, hand in hand with David, greeted by citizens who bowed respectfully, not out of fear but admiration. In private, she turned to him. Do you know what you've done? You've changed the empire itself. David shook his head with a soft smile. We did it together. You led, Solara. I just reminded them that there is another way. Solara laughed, the sound ringing free and joyful. For years, she had been a prisoner of duty, trapped in expectation. Now she felt unbound. The empire had shifted because of human courage, but also because she chose to stand with him. In the following weeks, the Velari began learning from humans. They adopted new methods of negotiation, of compromise, and of leadership. David taught them patience and creativity, showing that thinking differently did not make one weak. Solara observed these changes with satisfaction. She realized that humans were not physically superior to the Velari, nor technologically unmatched, but they possessed qualities that transcended strength or weaponry, empathy, courage, and ingenuity. It became clear to her that humans, though young in the galaxy, had something the oldest civilizations sometimes lacked, the ability to change not only themselves but others, by daring to think differently and act with integrity. One evening, as the city quieted and the twin moons rose, again, Solara and David stood atop the highest tower. Do you think the Empire will ever fully understand humans? She asked, her voice soft. David smiled. Maybe not fully, but understanding isn't necessary for respect. They have seen what humans can do when they are brave and wise. That is enough for now. Solara looked at him, her heart full. You were supposed to be weak. They called you fragile, and yet you've done more than anyone expected. I only did what humans do best, he replied. We adapt, we learn, and we try to do the right thing even when the world doubts us. Solara squeezed his hand. She felt proud, not only of him but of herself. She had chosen to stand by his side, to act boldly, and in doing so had helped guide the Empire into a new era. The galaxy will remember this, she said, not because of war but because of courage and wisdom, and humanity will be part of that legacy. David nodded. And so will you, Solara. You were the first to believe and the first to act. The moons reflected in the crystal towers, casting a silver light across the city. It was a light of hope, of change, and of possibility. The Velari Empire had survived a test not by force, but by courage, cleverness, and the human way. Solara whispered softly, almost to herself. They thought marriage would be my prison. Instead, it became my freedom. David smiled, pulling her close. And our freedom is only the beginning. Together we will show them that the galaxy is bigger than fear and stronger than pride. The citizens below, the nobles around the council, even rival factions far beyond the Empire's borders, would carry the story forward. A human had married the alien princess, and together they had reshaped the future. The Empire had been transformed. The galaxy had been reminded that humans were not weak, not insignificant. They were extraordinary in ways that could change entire civilizations. And at the heart of it, Solara knew the truth. It had been love, courage, and partnership that had accomplished what no army could. The alien princess had no choice but to marry, but her human groom had changed everything. Together, they had built a new legacy,